When it comes to portraying Godzilla, there's always been a very marked difference in the ways that America and Japan have portrayed him. Everything from personality to appearances, and the topic of today, which is Godzilla's height and overall size. After all, at only 50 meters tall, the original Godzilla is not even half of what the original height of monsterverse Godzilla was, at 108 meters. Though even MonsterVerse's Godzilla, which has for a while remained the tallest, was outsized by Godzilla Earth at over 300 meters tall. Though Godzilla Earth is a massive anomaly, pun intended. And MonsterVerse Godzilla is, ironically, really the only Godzilla to not tower over the skyline of the cities he does battle in. Which is why today we're going to be looking at Godzilla's height throughout the ages, how they made him such a titanic threat, and if size is truly everything, as well as answering if the seeming complaints about MonsterVerse Godzilla not feeling as large or imposing as he used to today are a uniquely MonsterVerse problem. Is Godzilla's height truly as versatile as the character himself? Let's find out today. Before we get on to the rest of the video, I want to thank you guys for tuning in. If you enjoy all the Colossal Kaiju content we do around here, we've got a lot more stuff planned, some anime discussion videos, some stuff about Transformers, and branching out into many more things. Subscribing is always appreciated as it helps make more amazing viewers like you find their way here, and if you want to support us more directly, we have now gotten channel members. I really didn't think we'd be getting it this fast. Anything I make from this channel is immediately reinvested back into making everything better, just like with the main gaming channel. Comment below what you guys would like to see us do next time, and let's get on to the titanic terror that is Godzilla. When it comes to Godzilla's height, they actually are portrayed relatively differently. A Godzilla that is, for example, much taller will obviously be less aware of the puny humans and the puny goings-on of us in the streets. However, a much smaller Godzilla will be able to seem almost more personally aggressive towards humanity, which itself can open up many possibilities for portraying the character. With the Toho classics, Godzilla stood head, shoulders, and really most of his body above the skyline of Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, and really any other city he found himself stomping around in. Few, if any, buildings were ever able to equal him in height or surpass him, though there were some of these in the Heisei Millennium and even back in the Showa era. However, these were the significant notable exceptions, and there was truly little expectation that they were going to survive very long in terms of a kaiju scuffle. Whereas on the other hand, with the MonsterVerse Godzilla movies, set in the much more modern, skyscraper-riddled cities, he is near surrounded by buildings, not only equaling him in height, but surpassing them, standing 50 to even 100 feet above him. The average building in New York City is around 500 feet tall, when MonsterVerse Godzilla, right now, is around 400. And I'd be hardly surprised if most major metropolitan locations around the world don't hover around that 500 benchmark. When it came to Toho's method of portraying Godzilla and getting that height differential in scale, Godzilla was of course a suit. He would be recorded, and later a footage of Godzilla will be played with backdrop to a city skyline, or in a setting with miniatures and Godzilla in the suit stomping around them, utilizing a lot of low-angle worm's eye view shots and slowing down the movements of the captured suit animations. By slowing down the movements, this would help convey the size and the power of each individual motion. This is an extremely common and very simple camera trick used throughout, well, most things. A great example of this is in Transformers. Frequently, Optimus Prime will be shown from a slight downward angle, and Megatron will be shown from a slight upwards angle, exaggerating how much taller Megatron is, making him look bigger and more imposing, especially when conversing with Optimus Prime, to make Optimus Prime look smaller. This is one of the reasons why in a movie like Godzilla Raids Again, where movement was actually sped up quite a bit because this was their first time doing kaiju battles, it does look a little bit strange seeing Godzilla move as quickly as he is. Most of this, though with CGI rather than miniatures, is how the MonsterVerse did things early on, and especially in Godzilla 2014. it used a lot of these very good low-angle shots. His movements were very relatively slow, giving you this great human-scale interaction with the monsters, something that even carried over during the Muto battles. But yet, the Muto battles never felt slow or overly drawn out. In fact, they were unfortunately interspliced with a great many cutaways, but the presence of the monsters shown in physical combat carries that weight. You get low-angle shots, you get very few overhead shots, but when they are shown with overhead shots, they are still moving relatively slow, and it does convey that power and that speed being slow with how they slam into buildings. Gareth Edwards, for all the cutaway issues of 2014, did a very good job of portraying the monsters as powerful forces of destruction. Something I hope he carries over in his Jurassic Park movie. The Hawaii scene is just a master class of this. When you see Godzilla walking through the streets slowly, you don't even see his whole body. You can hear the earth shaking with each and every step he makes. And that tsunami he creates when he's walking into Honolulu, it really captures this force of nature capacity of the character. King of the Monsters is where things somewhat started slipping, in a way not so different from Godzilla Raids Again. Godzilla has gotten a little bit faster in this movie. Likely, this was to keep up with King Ghidorah in fight scenes, as King Ghidorah himself is a much quicker, more agile and nimble character. And if they kept Godzilla's movement speed and movement style from Godzilla 2014, he would look like a very slow, lumbering, just stone compared to the much more smooth-moving, triple snake-headed dragon that King Ghidorah is, especially when it came to flying. So they likely needed to speed things up in order to make the fight scenes actually flow relatively well. However, the speed wasn't the only thing that made the sense of scale somewhat feel lessened, at least in theory. The other was they started going with this more eye-level camera, as we'll start calling it. You didn't get as many shots from, say, human level looking up at the monsters. They are still very much there in the movie, but there are more shots of around eye level showing the creatures fighting. You can see their face, because both Godzilla and King Ghidorah are relatively well capable of emoting in the movie. And simply having low angles would not allow you to see the characters' eyes. And their bodies would have gotten in the way of being able to view the fight. So it was largely a choice made out of practicality for the sake of being able to view the experience, rather than a deliberate choice to make Godzilla seem somewhat smaller in scale. This also paired up with that in the Boston fight sequence, Godzilla is not taller than all the buildings, though this is something we saw in San Francisco as well, and in both the oceanic fight midway through the movie and the first Godzilla and King Ghidorah fight in Antarctica, there really is nothing to give a sense of scale for how big the monsters are, other than us knowing Godzilla is this tall. As well as, there is an inconsistency in Godzilla's speed portrayal in the movie itself. You have the start of the fight where Godzilla and King Ghidorah are rushing towards each other and it creates that massive blast wave. They're booking it pretty fast. But then, a little bit later, they are moving at a little bit of a slower pace. Now this could have been done simply for rule of cool, for, that big trailer shot, because that is a pretty good trailer shot, which I think actually was in the trailer. But being right at the start of the fight, and in trailers, does leave a bit of a weird taste in people's mouth, as that's what they remember most. That, and midway through the rest of the Boston fight, most of it is actually leveled by the two titans battling it out. Now, in Legendary's defense, this is far from the first and only time Godzilla has battled like this. Many, many movies, in fact I would probably say most of them, have had Godzilla fighting the final boss or even midway through the movie in basically a giant open field devoid of most features. Godzilla vs. Biollante, Boz Island when fighting Space Godzilla for the first time, both final battles against the original Mechagodzilla, and his first fight against Mechagodzilla 2 in the Heisei era, his initial confrontation with King Ghidorah in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and basically the entirety of Godzilla Final Wars' four-way battle between Godzilla, Mothra, Gigan, and Kaiser Ghidorah / Monster X is in a cratered out wasteland that was formerly Tokyo after being flattened. And in that Final Wars battle, all the monsters are actually pretty agile and acrobatic, jumping around and doing all kinds of crazy fight moves. And that's not even the only time in that movie that they're doing crazy fight moves. In fact, I'd probably say that Final Wars Goji is probably the most acrobatic of all Godzilla there are, including the dropkick. Which also means Godzilla vs. Megalon. Same thing, giant open fields. In fact, it's something of a strange, almost tradition with King Ghidorah that Godzilla doesn't actually fight him in a city, which is actually Godzilla in King of the Monsters is actually probably the first time he's actually fought Ghidorah in a city. Mecha King Ghidorah was not King Ghidorah. I know someone's gonna say that. In Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Godzilla fights King Ghidorah alongside Rodan and Mothra on basically just a mountainside. When it comes to Invasion of Astro Monster, same thing, both on Planet X and at the end of the movie after being freed from the mind control. Godzilla vs. Gigan, he fights Gigan and King Ghidorah in basically the middle of nowhere, with the only big structure being the Godzilla Tower, which is generically Godzilla height. And, after all, destroy all monsters, the final battle with King Ghidorah is on Monster Island, where there's nothing. As mentioned, Heisei Godzilla facing King Ghidorah in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Many of these fights really lack senses of scale because they are also filmed at about eye or at best maybe shoulder level. And Godzilla is a relatively speedy battler in these fights. Now, Heisei did somewhat pull back and actually slowed Godzilla down for some of these more open fight scenes. So, this idea is a bit of an unfair criticism for the monsterverse in that it doesn't convey scale super well, because not only has Toho continued to do this, they were actually the ones that started it. Now, that was from the in-story battling perspective. This one is a bit more of a meta-contextual one, since in the past, as we mentioned, Godzilla was suitimation. They had to film a guy in a suit around miniatures. And when you're doing suitimation, it is far easier to have smaller buildings around you than to have basically bumping shoulders into much larger miniatures at all times. CGI making it easier to film larger buildings is the same reason why in Shin Godzilla and Godzilla -1, Toho is showing Godzilla against much larger buildings. After all, if they were too big, it would be difficult to actually film. It would be difficult to even set things up and record the scenes correctly, because any motion could damage or dislodge the miniatures. This is why, generally, notably tall buildings, when shown in Godzilla movies, will play some part in the fight scene, either being destroyed in spectacular fashion, or being utilized by the kaiju in battle some way, also resulting in destruction in spectacular fashion. Things like Space Godzilla telekinetically throwing Godzilla into, I don't know, a giant box-looking building, or in Godzilla Tokyo SOS, where Godzilla atomic ray blasts Kiryu through a building and into another building. So while separated by a building, Godzilla snipes him through the wall, getting a collateral. This allows Godzilla to, even if he is outsized by other buildings, to still feel powerful and still feel imposing, as other monsters have been able to use these tall buildings against Godzilla. In Godzilla 2000, this Millennium spaceship drops a building on top of Godzilla after knocking him down. Again, utilizing the environment in combat. When it comes to integrating the environment into the actual battle, Legendary has shown a mastery of this concept, making the cityscape actually matter and allowing it to affect and somewhat dictate events in the battle, rather than just a singular set-piece building destruction. It's a near constant method of fighting, with the kaiju utilizing the buildings for their own advantages. In Godzilla 2014, we have Godzilla slamming the male Muto into whatever that giant pointy-looking building in San Francisco is, which did the final blow to it. Godzilla slamming and plowing right through that one building with King Ghidorah's head, slamming King Ghidorah's face into another giant building. Ghidorah even utilizing the power generation station to juice itself up to supercharge blast everything around him. And things like Scar King utilizing the whip to throw a skyscraper at Godzilla in Kong. This is another way to show the power and the strength and scale of kaiju, even if they are being outsized by buildings, showing how effortlessly they're able to handle and destroy man-made structures. However, this does come at the cost of camera angles, which is really one of the best tried and true methods of showing scale. Though this does not mean they have not been able to mix these two concepts together, as Kong Skull Island showed this off far better than really the Monsterverse has as of late. They've really kind of slacked on this. Remember, Kong was only 31.6 meters or around 104 feet in that movie, but yet they utilized those low camera angle shots from human scale. In a place where there's no buildings for size comparison, they needed to rely on tricks like this to make Kong feel big and imposing, while still allowing him to interact with the environment in a lot of creative ways. Things like swinging around on mountaintops, going in the water, fighting that giant octopus, and in the battle with the Skull Devil, using a tree as basically a giant baseball bat, and when he gets thrown into all the rusted, decaying ships. That is one of the establishing size moments that still interact with the environment, while also allowing that to help influence the fight. It gives Kong a much better visual presence because they are able to film these fight scenes from a lower angle. Though there are several things actually in Kong's favor when it comes to being able to be filmed this way. Kong stands upright like human posture. He doesn't lean over and is hunched forward like Godzilla is. This means you can actually get those face reaction shots in addition to a low angle shot, paired up with the Skull Crawler and especially the Skull Devil, whose overall posture also lends itself well to this. They are hunched low to the ground. Their large forward arms and lowered heads mean you don't need to film from high up to see them. Really, everything about the fight is able to be displayed from a low angle. This isn't something you can actually do with Godzilla because of the way he stands. The humans also, for once, actually do add a great deal to this fight because of how much smaller Kong and the Skull Devil are. They can actually be relatively well involved in the fight to give some human scale comparisons, while also being able to actually help Kong in battle, without it feeling a bit strange and forced. We also get some great interactions with Kong when he is just ripping the choppers to shreds. You see him from this human scale that you don't really get with Godzilla as often in the Monsterverse. Now, part of this is because as of late in the Monsterverse, Godzilla has been kind of out of focus and instead focusing more on Kong, but that's a thing for another video. Another movie that shows almost this exact same mastery for actually the exact same reasons, which I think actually influenced Kong Skull Island cinematography in some way, is Pacific Rim. Yes, the opening part of the Hong Kong battle is in the water. You have no buildings for size and for scale. Instead, they are forced to rely on slow movements, letting the power of the attacks come through and the slowness help to inform the scale. Something that is helped out by throughout the movie, we are repeatedly given references to how large the Jaegers are, and from that, we are able to feel the scale of the kaiju. When it shifts over to the city portion of the fight, we see Gypsy Danger using shipping crates as basically brass knuckles to put the beating on Leatherback. Leatherback grabs a crane and just bashes Gypsy Danger with it. These are things that we pretty much all know how big they are, and showing them in relation to the kaiju and the Jaegers helps give that scale, while also still once again filming from low angles, for the same reason that Kong was able to be filmed from low angles and not really intrude on the ability to see the fight. Both the very humanoid Leatherback, which walks mostly like a giant gorilla, and the humanoid-shaped Gypsy Danger Jaeger don't really interfere with the visibility profile. When the fight progresses to fighting Otachi, instead it's almost the exact same thing as with the Skull Devil versus Kong. In fact, when I first saw the Skull Crawlers in Kong Skull Island, I actually mentioned to my brother and my dad, I wonder if they reused the rigs or animation anything programs from Legendary working on Pacific Rim for the Skull Crawlers, because they walk it basically the same way. You know, lizard serpentine-like overall body structure, long, big arm that they use primarily for walking. Now, I know that Skull Island was made by Warner Brothers, and Legendary was the one that made Pacific Rim. However, shortly after, it was announced that they were partnering together for the Monsterverse, so I wouldn't be surprised if Legendary had a little bit more involvement than we really know with Skull Island. But everything from the boat sword smashing into Otachi, to Otachi grabbing the boat and just throwing it away, to the utilization of the environment to their own advantages. Otachi hiding and then surprise attack jumping out of the building to slam Gypsy Danger into building after building. The non-intrusive nature of the overall body shapes of the kaiju helping to lend themselves to great low-angle shots. Another somewhat lesser known thing about this fight, or at least like less talked about aspect, is because the scene is set at night, but it is in the middle of a brightly lit city with big buildings surrounding it, this actually leaves the fight relatively well lit. So despite it being dark out, you can still have a relatively visible fight scene. Something that would have greatly benefited Godzilla 2014. I will truly never get over how dark that freaking movie is. It is almost impossible to see what's going on sometimes with my footage. When I saw the movie, it was a heck of a lot clearer. I don't know why it's so dark now. Since joining the main cast of the Monsterverse in Godzilla vs. Kong, the Monsterverse has gotten a lot more creative with integrating these cityscapes into the actual kaiju combat. Utilizing CGI means they're no longer limited and restricted by the mobility of giant rubber suits. It's kind of hard to overlook the fact that when it came to most of the classic Toho movies, they really did just devolve into beam blasts. It's part of why something like Godzilla vs. Destroya sticks out so much, because they're not just beam blasting one another, you actually see the kaiju fighting physically. We get to see Kong swing around the Hong Kong skyline on these much taller buildings, allowing him to gain a strategic and tactical advantage over Godzilla, who is overall a much more overpowering physical threat. While some could say that yes, this does somewhat mitigate the scope and scale of the kaiju by showing them getting outsized, I'd say it allows for a greater spectacle, because these are fight sequences we never could have gotten without the use of CGI. Seeing Kong just climbing buildings, then trying to just axe hammer drop onto Godzilla as he's atomic ray blasting is both pretty awesome, and I'd say actually does show scope and scale very well, since it reinforces just how big these creatures are. How strong and how powerful they are to be able to swing around these gigantic buildings. And you get to see some of the damage left behind as they are doing this. It opens up even greater city destruction scenes. Godzilla blasting Hong Kong skyscrapers is something we really didn't get to see as much of, even in Godzilla vs. Destroya. It's very hard to say that they don't understand how to do scope and scale when we get that first scene in Apex's facility in Pensacola, and you have Godzilla just towering over everything, obliterating everything in his path, or on the fight scene in the middle of the ocean when Godzilla is just climbing on top of the aircraft carrier, just overturning and destroying ships left, right, and center. Bringing it back to GXK, there's a lot of things about that movie I'm not the biggest fan of. But Scar King using the whip to throw a building, mentioned before it, is just silly and actually freaking awesome to watch. This and the pyramid scene really did show just how strong they are, that these gigantic structures literally are nothing to us. Though they are really the only two scenes that actually show off this scope and scale relatively well, as they have not been without their major moments of failure. Mechagodzilla in the Monsterverse, and especially his introduction, I love. Just the rising out of the floor, just the slowly turning on and coming out of that coiled up look, seeing all the little mechanisms move as it roars from this just downward angle. It's all great setting. However, because the entire scene takes place inside of an admittedly pretty massive Apex Cybernetics facility, it does make it actually feel kind of small, because we actually have no sense of scale for the character here. There is nothing else to compare it with. No, pylons sticking up or even humans around it we get to see. When I first saw it, I actually thought it was a prototype. And actually compounding this, when we see it fight number 10, the Skullcrawler, despite the fact that number 10 is actually an extremely massive Skullcrawler for his kind, because the regular Skullcrawlers are about 40 to 80 feet tall. Some different creators, as in the people who worked on the movie, have said that they're different heights. Maybe some are like 15 feet to 95 feet. But the best one I could find from official sources was 50 to 80 feet, which seemed to line up pretty well, as the Skull Devil was about closer to Kong's height, and maybe that 15 to 95 was including the Skull Devil. But number 10 is actually bigger than the Skull Devil. Because remember, Skull Devil was about Kong size. So even though, yes, number 10 was actually gigantic, we can't really tell because the only time we've seen skull crawlers is when they're pretty tiny. In comparison to Kaiju, keep in mind, again, they're freaking like, what, at minimum almost like 30 feet tall. But compared to, Godzilla, that's nothing. Which is one of the reasons why when he broke out of the Apex Cybernetics facility, I was shocked that, no, this is actually Mecha Godzilla. Again, really cool character, really cool introduction. I just think they could have done better with the scale. They kind of make up for this in the final fight with Godzilla and Kong tag teaming against Mecha Godzilla by showing Mecha Godzilla just slamming Godzilla into buildings, and, again, utilizing the buildings as a sense of scale, and as an interactive sort of almost weapon by Mecha Godzilla. He does help to sort of re-establish that, but by that point the fight's largely kind of over, and that introduction is really important to nail. GXK, though, is extremely guilty of this. This very poor framing, and much like Godzilla vs. Kong did have a lot of eye-level shots in the final battle, GXK has a lot of overhead-looking down shots. You can still get some good scale with eye-level shots, but looking down, it's a lot harder. We rarely, if ever, get to see any low angles, and the biggest offender of this has to be when Kong walks into the crowd of the great apes. This is a very, very high angle shot. We are in a crowd of Kong-sized kaiju. This should be an absolutely epic scene. And it's just not really. Again, they kind of have some shoulder level shots, but not nearly enough to capture the initial scope and scale of just a giant lava cave crammed to the brim with Kongs. It feels more like just a troop of gorillas more than a collection of Kongs. Some scenes are really okay, but don't overly show scale super well. Things like Kong's dental work thing, they do show, again, Kong is, pretty big, but he's laying down and, again, he's knocked out cold while they're taking his tooth out. Not exactly the best way to establish scale when your main kaiju is, out cold. The Iwi's Secret Village, with the Zero-G fight, hit or miss there. Again, Zero-Gs are floating around, makes sense, but that fight's a bit all over the place and actually over pretty quick before stuff can really set in. I say this as, remember what I said before, how Legendary and Toho tend to use Godzilla for very different purposes with their movies. They tend to play up very different aspects of the character in their respective movies, with Toho leaning much more towards the destroyer and the terror, with Toho leaning far more towards that destroyer and terror aspect of the character, giving a significant scale presence, being first and foremost, at least as of late, by going somewhat smaller scale Godzilla in comparison to Legendaries, with more human interactions, as these are solo Godzilla movies. With Legendary, on the other hand, or Claw in this case, going for bigger and badder spectacle awesomeness. This has been something that has only seemed to come out as of late, as take a look at any of the Godzilla movies, really from the Heisei and the Millennium era. There was this, again, leaning much more on spectacle for a lot of the classic Toho movies, and only as of late have they doubled down on movies with things like Shin and -1. The spectacle is very much still there when it comes to Toho, but it's not as much of a priority as the portrayal of Godzilla as this destructive, overwhelming presence. Just as in the Monsterverse movies, Godzilla the Destroyer is still a component of the character. We see the destruction his fights leave behind, but their prerogative is, we're gonna take awesome kaiju and make it fight other awesome kaiju, and gonna have some awesome effects. Since Toho is running solo with Godzilla in the movies, they can do those low-angle shots and not be obstructive, because there's no other kaiju doing battle with Godzilla. The destruction is the main focus, rather than a consequence of the actual main focus. Mixed in with just a lot of those fantastic wham shots of Godzilla that really tend to stick out in our minds, even if they aren't always the most reflective of the movie itself. I remember in Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, that scene of Godzilla just going down the alleyway after the humans always stuck out in my head. Doesn't really play the biggest part in the rest of the movie, but it's a one heck of a frickin' wham shot. And that's actually a project we're going to be working on in a significantly greater capacity, a much longer dedicated video to it on its own. So stay tuned for that if you guys want to see that. So, bringing it all back full circle to the question that spawned this entire video. Does size matter? For Godzilla, yes. However, one isn't better or more correct. It's simply, what is the nature of the Godzilla movie you're going for in the end? That is generally going to dictate the size of Godzilla and the scale of Godzilla you're going to be having, and the focus on showing that scale. A larger Godzilla will likely be far better for a spectacle battle, while a smaller Godzilla can be far better for a terror scenario, especially in a solo movie. Because Godzilla is much smaller scale, especially for a solo movie like that, you can make the perception that it is more personal. Godzilla is closer to us physically in terms of visibility, so he can be consciously aware of the little humans going around and doing things. Now, the same could actually work in reverse, as these two things are not necessarily hard to set. A giant Godzilla can work fantastic for terror. Having him be completely unaware of us, just showing how insignificant we are before the force of nature of destruction that is Godzilla. Just as a smaller Godzilla could also potentially work well in a spectacle scene, showing a smaller Godzilla completely obliterating these gigantic buildings alongside other kaiju. The framing and size of Godzilla are really just simply tools, and fairly simple ones at that. This is also not another America doesn't understand Godzilla. Trust me, we've got something on that in the works. We actually do understand Godzilla relatively well. Obviously not as well as Japan does, but I'd say we understand it pretty well, seeing as Toho has to greenlight every Godzilla movie Legendary makes. If we didn't understand Godzilla, you really think they'd let us make him? It's just, as Americans, when it comes to us making Godzilla movies, we tend to focus on a different style of Godzilla movies. For better or worse. Again, Japan tends to lean on another aspect of the character entirely when it comes to movies. Using the same logic used to create the Americans don't understand Godzilla argument, Toho is making Godzilla movies focusing on the lesser number of movies focusing on the aspect of Godzilla as a terror and a destroyer, as basically the vast majority of Godzilla movies in all of the eras did turn into just spectacle fights. There's a few of them focusing, of course, on the terror and the destroyer nature of Godzilla, but these were much more few and far between. If Toho is making the movies, and if Toho is not making movies on the more frequently shown nature of Godzilla, does that mean they don't understand it? See why this argument makes no sense. I'm being hyperbolic for the sake of comedy, because that argument just makes no sense to me. Again, we'll be ripping into that later. I've been wanting to for a while. In short, Legendary focuses on action, Toho focuses on seriousness and terror. Just let them both cook, because if one's doing one, the other can focus on the other and lay it into their specialties. That is all, guys. Sorry if this one went on a little bit of a ramble tangent here and there. There was just a lot really to talk about this. Thank you for watching. If you guys haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe for more. Comment your thoughts below, and while you're down there, leave a like. If you want to help support the channel, you can become a member. And let us know what you would like to see next. I've been Max Allo, and I'll see you next time. Long live the Kaiju King.